Hello students, how are we doing today? This video here will cover Unit 1 of APUSH Lesson 3, um, the European expansion and the Columbian exchange. We're going to focus on the European overseas expansion uh, resulting from the Columbian exchange and a series of interactions within societies across the Atlantic Ocean. Okay, so that's kind of where we're going. So we know that Spain and Portugal led the early explorations. Spain and Portugal are on a peninsula, and by being on a peninsula, they have a lot of coastlines. And because of the coastlines, they have lots of ports, and they're very sea oriented, fishing, sailing, and that leads to exploration. When we think of Portugal, when we think of Portugal, we have to think about Prince Henry the Navigator. Henry the Navigator created those navigational schools, helped develop new innovations in shipping. They created the caravel with the triangle shaped sails. They this school also taught about map uh, printing or map making, um, dealt with the technologies eventually of the sextant, astrolabe, compasses. So there was really kind of a driving force, kind of teaching people how to sail. So it was a lot of educated people for this time period put together and to help with the exploration. We also know people like Vasco da Gama, some of the early uh, uh, explorers to once again they're looking for a faster way to get to India and get to Asia for trade for spices to try to cut out the Middle East and Italy, kind of the middlemen that would jack the prices up or raise the prices up so that they make profit. So Europe was looking for another water route to Asia. And so, like I said, they did go around Africa into India, but they were like, we got to find a better way. We got to find a faster way. So people like in Spain wanted to explore, and a young man called Christopher Columbus, originally an Italian, well, originally he is an Italian, went to Italy, asked them if they would pay for him to explore because he would like to go west. And people were afraid back then. People were afraid to head out into the Atlantic Ocean because of the unknown. In his eyes, and he's not wrong, that you could go across the Atlantic Ocean and end up in Asia. If obviously the Western Hemisphere, the Americas weren't there, then he would be true. Um, so in 1940 or 1492, he's going to set sail for Spain and head westward. When we think about factors that led for the exploration, the three G's: God, glory, and gold, right? But we know we have improved technology, steel, guns, improved shipping, printing press, the Renaissance. These things, we are pushing us to explore new worlds and to explore and expand. Now, we know once Columbus arrived and other the Spanish and Portuguese started coming to the New World, there was interactions between the natives and Europeans, and we know in the first 100 years or so of Europeans being in the New World, we're going to see about 90% of the indigenous people are going to die, or the population is going to diminish by 90%. Many of it was because of smallpox, because of illness, sickness, disease. Um, they lacked the immunity, haven't been around these kind of urban diseases. We also know the Spanish are going to enslave the indigenous people, put them as mining plantations, in encomiendas, which is like sort of like a housing slash slave or servitude type of environment. This eventually led to what they call the Black Legend. The Black Legend is this ideology, this all encompassing idea of the Spanish and their cruelty and exploitive and self righteous ideas. And it's just kind of like the dark side. The Black legend represents really the dark side of Spanish exploration and colonization and imperialism of the New World. Um, we know that Spain and Portugal are going to want to spread their ideas of Christianity, specifically Catholicism. Okay, and those things will be spread um, into the New World. We know that many, as the population of indigenous people fell off and were worked to death, places like Barbados had shortages of labor. So the Spanish and Portuguese needed labor to fill that spot, and that's where we saw West African slaves fill that shortage or that spot of indigenous slave labor. Sugar is vitally important to this to the Spanish, the Portuguese, to Europeans in general, because essentially we become addicted to the sweetness of it. And even today, we still have sugar in so many things, or if it's not sugar, raw sugar, or anything, we use corn syrup. But that idea of the sweetening. Um, Once again, we're traveling to other places, and this leads to this whole idea of the Columbian Exchange, eventually mercantilism, and leads to our country, or not our country, our world changing dramatically and forever with the movement of goods, people, and ideas across continents. Now, we know in the Caribbeans, we see the growth of what they call maroon societies. These are societies of runaway slaves that used guerrilla warfare to defend themselves. Some groups would go from island to island, um, but essentially, you saw rival tribe members that looked at themselves as um, in this together as runaway slaves, and they maintained and kept their practice of their Western African culture together. So even today, 2020, you can still go into many Caribbean areas um, where the Maroon societies were resident, and you could still see some of their culture, their music, their art that have been kind of dispersed within the Caribbean islands, some areas of Latin America, where those ideas have been spread throughout. But we know the push to head to Asia obviously left us, after Columbus came across to this new land, and we saw what they call conquistadors, conquerors. We saw Cortez conquer the Aztecs in what is modern day Mexico, Pizarro conquering the Inca in modern day Peru. It's all about those gold, silver, precious jewels that so many people, the monarchies wanted to gain that wealth. Um, the conquistadors were able to do this because of steel, eventually because of guns. They had, the indigenous people were more open at first and welcoming until obviously the Europeans started to conquer. Now, when we think about this too, the Europeans looked at some of the indigenous' openness as a weakness. The Europeans looked at the indigenous people's spiritual ideas that didn't follow the ideas of Catholicism as a weakness. So it was imperative for them to conquer and change and alter the inferior, as they would say, civilizations of the Western Hemisphere. So here you could see this is essentially a chart showing the decimation of the native population because of illnesses and sicknesses and because of forced labor in the encomienda system um, to the Native Americans. So we will see once again because of that decimation, because of the lack or the supply or the shortage, I should say, of labor, we'll see the Portuguese and Spanish will set up trading ports on the western coast of Africa. and they will take slaves, captured slaves from West Africa in what they call the Middle Passage. So the Triangle Trade, essentially, this is where we're leading to the Triangle Trade, where it's Europe, Africa, and the Americas. And the Middle Passage is that transportation between Africa and the Americas. Now, boats never traveled the Triangle Trade empty. So you would see Europeans would send finished goods, guns to Africa, trade, and they would use the guns to trade along with other finished goods to trade for slaves. But the guns were important even to the slave traders in Africa because they could use the guns to help put more fear and authority in their rule as they gathered slaves. Slaves would take the Middle Passage. Middle Passage is the worst possible life for anyone, being packed in like sardines in the hull of the ship. Uh, the smell, the urine and feces in the bowels of the ship. Um, it was such a bad living conditions inside the hull of the ship. You saw it when they brought some of the slaves to the top to clean them up. Some would jump in the water and hoping to swim for freedom. Some people even died in the hull of the ship on the journey. They would ration food on the journey of the Middle Passage because they weren't sure how long it would actually take because you were dependent upon the currents and the winds. So it could be 1 week one time, it could be 2 weeks another time, it could be 3 weeks another time. So they would ration food, and some people would starve. Now, from the Americas to Europe, they would send raw materials, the things, new plants, new animals, things that Europe didn't have. They would start bringing those things over, along with any kind of gold or silver or precious gems. So here you can see in this old etching a depiction of slave traders taking the slaves to the West Coast. And as you can see, the slave trader in the middle, off to the right a little bit, the slave trader is carrying a gun. Once again, that gun most likely came from Europe. Now, in our reading packets, you were supposed to read the Equiano passage. This passage talked about this narrative, this kind of biography of the journey that Equiano gave, talked about the difficulties that he had to overcome in coming across. You remember, many people were unsure of where they're going. Everything was foreign. Um, if you were captured with a sibling or your parents when you got across, if you were still alive, you were auctioned off. He was afraid that people, Equiano thought maybe they were going to eat him, practice cannibalism. It was such a confusion with, along with terror and fear and sadness and just these terrible conditions. Um, Not understanding the language, it was a very difficult journey and process. And then they're going to new land. Now, let's think about this. If you have um, the slaves are being brought over, they knew freedom, right? So they're going from freedom to being enslaved, and that's why you saw in certain areas you have those maroon societies because of the runaway slaves. But if you were captured, you were made an example of to other slaves. We also know uh, in the Spanish uh, colonies, they set up what they call a caste system, where you would see like a peninsulare, which would be European born people, 100% European, born in Europe. They would be like in the top of the pecking order. And then the caste system would go down. If you were 100% European but born in the New World, you were a second class citizen. And it went down by percentage of blood of Europeans, along with if you're an indigenous, like if you're a mestizo, where you're half European, half indigenous. If you're a mulatto, half African, half European. So there was these different steps, and that's kind of set up your rank within society. All right, that's kind of this caste system set up a rank. Some in some areas, the Europeans, were told to marry indigenous people, to marry indigenous women, to force their hand into the European culture, um, to break away from their what the Europeans thought were an inferior style of life, that was the natives' life. Like the natives' spiritual ideas, their like their civilizations, things like that. Because once again, in the Europeans' eyes, the indigenous people are inferior. But all of this creates this Columbian exchange, this movement of goods, people, and ideas, diseases. And this would permanently change the world, these movements of things. Um, and you saw fruits and vegetables and plants and animals, domestic animals that are being brought back and forth, and introduced to new communities. So we saw this going back and forth. And once again, this completely changes the world, these movements of goods. Here's another example, another picture that kind of shows this, where, sugar and rice and malaria, yellow fever, and just the movement of tobacco, maize, and cattle, pigs, wheat and grains. And so you saw the movements of things, once again, transforming the world. Here, this is a famous painting from Van Gogh. This painting uh, shows essentially the movements of food. When you think of potatoes, potatoes are not native to Ireland, um, not native to Europe. They came through that Columbian exchange, and it became something that people in Ireland became dependent upon. And we even know when there was the potato famine later on, if you're taking European history, the potato famine led people to leave Ireland and go to the New World, go to America. So this is a famous painting. Once again, is representative of the movement of say potatoes or goods, people, and ideas across continents. So you should be able now to evaluate the causes that led to the Europeans expanding into the Americas. You should be able to analyze some of the social, political, and economic impacts of European expansion, and then explain any themes that were evident within this lesson that will have an impact on later American history. Okay, like I gave you an example of the Irish coming to America because of the potato famine, but where did the potatoes come from? They originally came from the Western Hemisphere. So this is a short, like I said, this is um, a lesson 3. Um, have a great day, and we'll talk to you again.